Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatorica, and Dr. Tobias Capwell of the Wallace Collection. Now, at the moment, there's a very special exhibition about Richard III and his armour here at the Wallace Collection, which you can visit right now, totally free to visit, and I highly recommend you do. So, tell us a bit about the exhibition. How did this come about? Why is it on at the moment? And we'll talk about the armour after that.
Yeah, well, basically, in 2021, I was approached by the production company preparing a new film, a new feature film called The Lost King. And this is a whimsical dramatization of the events surrounding and leading up to the discovery of Richard III's grave and remains. And it's the story of Philippa Langley, who led that effort and really promoted it and was really the force behind it. And it's her personal view of it in some ways, although it's interpreted very much by the authors of the film, Steve Coogan and Jeff Pope. And anyway, I was brought in as the historical advisor for this project, primarily because at some part in the film, not to spoil it for people too much, at some point in the film, Richard III, there's a view of Richard III as a knight, as the leader at the Battle of Bosworth. He appears in different parts of the film in different guises, but there's one moment when he appears with his knights in his armor on horseback, and it's important for the way the film works that glimpse of the warrior king, Richard, is right. It has to, the producers really felt that it had to be an authentic image, or as authentic as possible. And you know about this kind of business. You know how rare it is that a production company cares at all about such things. Most of the time, feature films don't have a historical advisor. Or if they do, they don't necessarily have any intention of listening.
No.
But here, I was presented with this, and they said, look, no, this is really important to us. And I said, well, it's going to cost you a lot more money than you were expecting to spend. And they said, it's important to us, tell us what it's going to take. So I said, well, the first thing is, all the armor's got to be real. I am not going on to this with polyurethane and plastic. I understand the virtue of the use of those materials in certain contexts, but not as primary action, not as foreground, not for the central characters in the forefront of the action. A lot of producers, directors, directors of photography, they seem now to belabor themselves. They're laboring under the misapprehension that polyurethane painted silver looks just like metal. And it really doesn't.
Or moves like it.
Right, or behaves like it.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I thought, if I'm going to do this, this has also got to be a moment for me to put a different kind of armor image on screen. At
that point, there's an interesting, because one of your predecessors in many ways, James Mann, had a similar experience with the movie industry. Do you want to, for anybody who doesn't know, explain a bit about that?
Yes. Well, as I was once I was on the project, and as I was getting into the research, by thinking, okay, what do I think Richard III actually wore at Bosworth? When you do a reconstruction, you suddenly have to make decisions. You can't just say, like a historian, well, it might have been this, it might have been that, and we don't really know. If you're going to build something, you've got to make choices about all the nitty-gritty, not just the style of the armor, not just the heraldry, but what does the belt look like? What do the shoes look like? There might be no evidence of that, but I had to choose all of that. So there was this research process happening, and I remember thinking, this is turning into something a little more interesting than just costume work for a film. And then I realized that actually there's a longer story here. Actually, the Wallace Collection has this fascinating relationship with Richard III. Not with the historical Richard III, but with the myths and reimagined iconic image of Richard III.
Yeah.
You know, that
The legend.
but even if, you know, it's an imaginative process.
Yeah.
When you look at history to one degree or another, and we're always reimagining these people according to our own time, according to the information that we have available.
And politics with Richard III as well.
Right, of course. So and interestingly, the last time that there was an attempt made to put a historically legitimate view of Richard III on screen was in Laurence Olivier's 1955 film of the Shakespeare play. Now you can see how people get confused with myth and reality, right? Shakespeare's play is the foremost exemplar of the myth of Richard III.
Very much demonizing him, and you know,
accentuating one side. And
something written for the Tudor dynasty to tell of this terrible usurper from.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare wasn't writing history. Shakespeare was writing popular fiction, and he needed to sell tickets. It's wrong by that point to call him propaganda or anything like that. This is just a salacious, fabulous, sensational story. And what do writers of fiction like that do when they're dealing with mythic figures that have a historical basis? What do? The first thing they do is say, what if it's all true, right? What if everything's true? What if he killed everybody, you know? And what if he is the worst that you could possibly imagine, right? That's what Shakespeare does. But Olivier is filming the Shakespeare play, but in his whole production design, he's trying to, as faithfully as he can, recreate and evoke the 15th century, the historical context of the real Richard III. So you can see how people got confused, or they have been confused more recently. Olivier's film, you know, got millions of viewers when it was shown on television in America in the 1950s. And that's more than the total number of stage audiences all the way back to the 16th century. I mean, the impact of the Olivier film can't really be overstated, right? And it was a Wallace Collection curator who worked on that film. Not me, but Sir James Mann, who was one of the 20th century's great experts in European arms and armor. He was the director of the Wallace Collection. He was the master of the Tower Armories. He worked for the Royal Collection. He's a towering figure in arms and armor. But he was also Olivier's historical advisor on 2 films. First on Henry V in 1944, and then on Richard III in 1955. So the Wallace at key points throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries has had an influence, a continuing influence on the way we imagine Richard III.
And of course those 2 movies, you just mentioned Henry V and Richard III, are notable for their, relatively speaking, historical accuracy of the armour shown. You know, better than, okay, some of it was not necessarily made of steel or even metal in some cases, but the overall shape and form and the look of it was better than countless movies in subsequent decades.
Still is.
Yeah.
Still is. I mean, when people ask me what's a good armor movie where they actually did it right, it's Henry V every time. In Henry V, most of the armor was metal. It was proper armor.
Okay.
In the 1955 Richard III film, they made one big mistake, which was to make the armor, all of it, out of rubber.
Okay.
And even people who worked on the production when they were filming, I found the accounts of, you know, filming the battle scene in Spain. There are people on production who said this rubber armor is such a mistake. It's such a nightmare. It looks terrible. It's bending all over the place.
Yeah.
And, you know, look at pictures of Olivier. You can see that their patterns were right. They were copying Wallace Collection armor.
Yeah.
But it's rubber and it doesn't look great.
Doesn't move right.
I can still see that they've done the homework. And I can see what they're trying to do, and I appreciate that. But the rubber was a mistake. And Olivier experienced that mistake in a very physical, first-hand way when a stunt went wrong on the first day of filming. There's a stunt where an archer needs to shoot and kill Olivier's horse.
Okay. And
the horse dies, falls down. Richard III jumps off, and then it's a horse, they have to explain why he then has to deliver that speech.
Right.
So they had a big protective plate underneath the horse's caparison, and they had a stuntman who was going to shoot an arrow into this protective plate. Arrow sticks in the horse, stunt horse falls over, you're done. Except the stuntman shot Olivier straight through the leg. Shot him straight through the calf muscle.
Oh my God.
And so that's why you shouldn't make your armor out of rubber. And if he'd been wearing the Henry V armor, he'd probably be all right. But,
or this armor.
but interestingly, that scene, the battle scene, was the first part of the film they shot before they went back to London, to Pinewood or Elstree or wherever they were, to shoot the interiors and the set scenes. But Olivier, all the way through that film, you watch the film, he's limping. And he's limping not because it's a character effect, but because he's actually limping because he's just been shot through the leg.
Okay, so moving forwards in time to 2021, I think you started on this.
Yep.
So tell us a bit about how this came to be.
Okay, well, the first thing I have to think about is what are we aiming for? What is my best guess at that moment in regard to what Richard III would have worn at Bosworth and what he would have looked like? What evidence is there? What other decisions do we make? And why do we make them? And once we've established our goal, then we have to work within the constraints of the production. The main constraints being we got 2 months and that's it, and we've got a limited amount of money. They've already upped the budget for this armor considerably, but there's a limit to what can be done. It isn't unlimited.
And making armor takes time. It's not something you can just,
Right.
not good armor anyway. Yeah.
For any amount of money, there's a time factor. And in the 1970s, when they made lots of really fabulous historical epics, they had like 3 years pre-production time to just design and research and build. Now, you're lucky if you get 6 or 8 months. And in this case, I had 2 months.
So for casual viewers who aren't necessarily armor experts who are watching this video, I think it's also important to mention that for Richard III, we don't have a surviving armor. Unlike Henry VIII, where we've got several harnesses and sketchbooks and paintings and representations, we know what he was wearing at different times. We know how his body shape changed and how the armor had to change to accommodate that. We just don't know this for Richard III, do we?
Or for anybody, really, in the Middle Ages.
Exactly. So how do you come at this? You're starting with nothing almost. How do you come at it? What's the first thing you do to try and decide what was Richard III wearing in 1485?
Well, the first thing I do is think, is there any direct evidence at all of any kind? Is there anything we know reasonably for certain? And there is. There is an eyewitness account of the Battle of Bosworth, written at second hand, but still originating with a mercenary captain, Juan Salazar, who'd worked for the Habsburgs and then, was
Spanish?
Ended up in the ended up in the service of Richard III, and he was there at Bosworth as a military advisor. And his eyewitness report of the battle made its way back to King Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile slightly later.
Okay.
And Juan Salazar is interesting because he advised Richard III to flee the battlefield. When they could see that the Duke of Norfolk's vanguard was disintegrating, he said, look, you gotta leave now.
Yeah.
And Richard III famously said, no, I will stay as a king or die, right? But Salazar also says that Richard III wore the royal arms on his coat, what they call coat armor, which is not armor. It's an embroidered surcoat that is for heraldic display.
Yeah.
He wore that, and he wore a crown on his helmet. So whatever you do next, your reconstruction has to agree with those key primary descriptions.
So the crown on the helmet is something we find, that's mentioned in Henry V, Agincourt kind of context as well. So it seems to have been conventional for a monarch to wear a crown on their helmet.
It is.
For obvious reasons.
It's absolutely the long established medieval and probably pre-medieval precedent for kings and war leaders to make their presence on the battlefield as obvious as possible. It's a well understood medieval tenet of warfare that an army that has its king present will win against an army that does not.
Yeah.
The king has a huge personal effect on the battlefield. He's the candle that people follow in the dark. And a lot of modern people say, yeah, but isn't he a target? Well, they didn't have long-range sniper rifles in the 15th century. Even if you know where your enemy king is, chances are there's not a lot that you can immediately...
And they're surrounded by the hardest, toughest people that they can get with the best armor and the best horses.
And the good ones are trained warriors themselves, who are perfectly capable of defending themselves.
Yeah.
So and regardless, whatever the disadvantages of a leader being seen to be present might be, the advantages vastly outweigh it. Vastly.
Yeah.
And Richard III, is a special case where this was necessary. He suffered from problems of legitimacy. There were Yorkists bleeding away from his household in 1484. People, moving to the other side. People questioning whether he had the right to be where he was. So at Bosworth, he needed to appear as God's anointed king on the battlefield, and he needed to sweep down on his illegitimate rabble of an enemy. Like Saint Michael coming down out of heaven.
Yeah.
So that kind of imagery was especially important to him, but not limited to him by any means.
Yeah. And in terms of the surcoat, which might, by some people, referred to by maybe tabard, other names that might come up that you see bandied around.
The terminology for these garments is very messy.
Yeah.
And the medieval Richard III would have called that a coat armor.
Yeah, okay.
And that's the term, and I've published that in my book, and I've talked about the sources for that. The problem with that as a term for modern usage is that it's not armor.
Yeah.
You say coat armor, and people rightly think of a protective garment, but that's not what it is. So I have fallen back on the habit of just calling it a surcoat. Now, etymologists will argue with that and think I'm wrong, but I just want to be understood. That's the main thing.
Yeah.
And I just adopt a term that works for what I'm doing.
And the words arms and armorial also have the confusing because they relate to heraldry as well, the College of Arms and armorial bearings and these things.
Hard. We want to use historical terminology as much as we can, but it's a minefield, and we also need to be understood. So we know that. Then the next big question with building this armor is, what style? Luckily, in this case, we know the period. It's 1485, right? We know that. But what style? Your viewers who know something about armor already will know how quickly armor as technology, but armor as fashion as well as wearable works of art, it evolved very rapidly. It evolved because of technical pressures and technical improvements, but also because fashions were changing, the things people liked and wanted changed.
And I think this is something which is not necessarily widely known or clear to casual viewers or people who have a casual interest in the Middle Ages, is that much like cars today, we look at a certain car and we think, okay, that probably dates 15 years ago, that dates 10 years ago, that dates 30 years ago. We know just by looking at the car, and it would have been very, very similar in the 15th century because, armour in the 1450s looks distinctive from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and they're changing the whole time, pretty much at a similar rate to cars today, I'd say, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if you put yourself in that mindset of, you can look at a car and sort of instinctively, just background knowledge, roughly, that's 15 years old. It would have been similar for armour then.
Yeah.
And there still would have been, in 1485, there still would have been armours on the battlefield from the 1460s and 70s.
Of course, but not being worn by
But
the
not
king.
by the king, yes, because the king would have had the brand new, like with cars today, would have had the brand new up-to-date thing, not the old one from 20 years ago.
When he appeared at Bosworth, everything about his image had to be as spectacular and rich and luxurious and splendid as possible. Splendor and glory are, key words here. Now, we know, there's a document, it's in my next book, that shows us that late in 1483, not long after Richard III came to the throne, he bought from Italian and Flemish merchants 168 complete Italian armors.
That's a lot.
Yes, that each individual armor was relatively inexpensive, but the bill still totaled up to 560 pounds, which is a vast amount of money in the 15th century.
And this is not for him personally, of course. He doesn't need 160, so this is for his closest.
Yes, he's basically gearing up his household knights and retainers and bodyguards to a standard that may exceed what they themselves were capable of affording out of their own means. He's forming a very large, fully armored bodyguard. He was expecting trouble, right? And so we know that, hey, at Bosworth at least, his people are fitted out with Italian and Italianate armors. And that's very interesting because Richard III at Bosworth departed quite dramatically from the traditional way of fighting by the English. The English way of war. For 150 years, the English had emphasized the habit of taking their fully armed knights off the horses and fighting on foot with their archers and other infantry. That was the standard English way of doing it.
With specialised foot fighting weapons like poleaxes and glaives.
Right. The English were famous for their proficiency, their love of the poleaxe and the two-handed sword. And there's probably a lot of spears in there as well. Let's not forget the garden variety spear. So that's what they've been doing. They were capable of getting onto their horses when they needed to, but it wasn't their standard method of deployment. And at Bosworth, it's really notable that Richard III chose to reserve himself with a body of heavy cavalry, his knights and bodyguards and closest retainers, the people he could count on. We don't know how many he had. It could have been about 150. It could have been as many as maybe 300. It's hard to be absolutely sure. And people say, oh, well, 300 is not very many. 300 fully armed knights is impressive, I guarantee you. And it can still, if it's applied properly, it can still have a decisive effect on the battlefield. And later in the 16th century, Tudor chroniclers, who by later 16th century had some distance from the events in question, they started to characterize Richard III's cavalry action at Bosworth as an impetuous, spur-of-the-moment, impulsive, maybe ill-advised spasm in the face of defeat at the end of the battle, then going down in flames. But that's not how heavy cavalry action works.
No.
You can't do that. You have to plan it. You have to set it up.
You can't just rustle up a cavalry force and a cavalry charge.
Your knights don't have radios in their helmets. They have to be told in advance what's going to happen and what they need to do when.
And the preparation for a fully armoured knight and their horse, and all their hangers-on, all of their retainers to get them there.
Let's say you do have 300 fully armed knights. Just go to the maximum. That means you need like 1,000 people at least involved in the preparation.
Just to get them there.
And you need to be on the right ground. Yeah. You need to have areas that you can reliably charge through to achieve the effect. And we know for a fact that Richard III got to the area of Bosworth the day before the battle. He chose his ground, the ground that we've now discovered through the archaeology. It's not up on a hill. He's down on a plain. He's at the top of a gently dropping rise. It's perfect cavalry country. He set the whole thing up.
Yeah.
It was just a matter of when in the battle do we go? when in the battle do we shoot off this horse-powered cruise missile, right? So the armor and equipment that they are choosing to wear has to be informed by that intention.
Yeah.
And that is invariably not the English style of the time, but rather Italian or Italianate armor. French armor, Flemish armor, West Continental armor under Italian technological influence.
So just for a small tangent for a second before we come back to the armour, for anyone who doesn't know, Richard III was vastly experienced at battlefield fighting, wasn't he? He was, yeah, I mean, he'd fought through the wars alongside his brother. He'd fought all over the country. As I understand it, he had quite a good book collection of treatises as well. He had
Xenophon.
Yeah, and I think Vegetius and things like that. So he was basically a career soldier, wasn't he? He wasn't just some monarch, and he hadn't been a monarch for very long, but he wasn't just some monarch who sort of left all of that stuff up to their commanders. He was a soldier.
And even the most negatively biased chroniclers, the ones who have the worst things to say about him in the early 16th century, they all agree that he was a great warrior, and they all have a begrudging respect for the fact that he stayed on the battlefield and went down in flames.
Yeah.
Not
many kings do that in history.
He was the last one.
Yeah.
In England.
So back to the armour. So you came across a record talking about him purchasing these Italian and Flemish armours. Is it Flemish style armour made in Italy? Is it some Italian armour, some Flemish armour? What's the detail of that?
Yeah. Well, this whole project couldn't help but be informed by the final stages of my work on my Armour of the English Knight project. And the third book, which is coming out soon, is all about, entirely, the presence of continental armor in England, the degree to which the English used foreign equipment, and when, and why, and of what different styles. The third book, which is all about this, is longer than either of the other two.
Right.
And it has the virtue of having some actual armor in it.
Yeah.
but a piece of that work showed me that in the 1480s, Flemish armor in particular, typical of what was being made in Bruges, for example, the great armor-making city of Bruges, was becoming the peak of fashion during Richard III's reign. I mean, it's generally known that the Yorkists were heavily influenced by the Burgundians, and they had close family and diplomatic relations with the Burgundians. You know, Edward IV and Richard III's sister was married to the Burgundian Duke, Charles.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in 1470, when Edward IV and Richard III had to leave England with the clothes on their back because of a Lancastrian resurgence under the Earl of Warwick, they sheltered in Bruges. Bruges is the major center of armor production, and it was also the home of Hans Memling, who leaves behind an extraordinary corpus of the best, most gloriously painted depictions of armor of that moment.
Yeah.
And we also have key English effigy sources dating from the 1480s that show that as well.
Okay.
So at that moment, that is what's going on in Richard III's court, and therefore I felt that we were right to make a Flemish style armor for him. The Flemish armor of the 1480s is vaguely Italianate, but it's very distinctive in its own way. And they do things a little bit differently, and we've put those references on this armor.
Okay, I think so. When you were first telling me about this, and lots of sort of light bulbs were going off in my head, I thought that makes so much sense of this manuscript, commonly known as the Beecham Pageant manuscript in the British Library, which you can view online actually in full glorious resolution. It makes so much sense of what we see in there, and that does date to this sort of 1483, 85-ish period, doesn't it? Exactly this.
There's a good case to be made for the patron of that work being Richard III's queen,
right?
Who was a member of the Beecham family.
Right. Okay.
Sir Richard Beauchamp was her grandfather.
So visually,
Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments.
so visually, that manuscript is sort of a prime bit of source material, isn't it, for this?
And
for this.
it's remarkable for showing everybody in that manuscript is wearing Anglo-Flemish armor of this period. So
Yeah.
we need, I felt, as well as using my other Flemish sources, we need to make this guy look like the Beauchamp pageant.
So loads of people out in the world for decades, I think, have thought, oh, 15th century, there's Italian armour and there's German armour, and everyone wears either Italian armour or German armour, because this is what people are used to seeing in museums, because so much Italian armour and so much German armour survived. What a lot of people don't realise is there's some Flemish armour, there's lots of sallets and things like that come from Flanders, Burgundy. That's not the case, is it? As you've shown with your books, there is an English style of armour, there's definitely a Spanish, Iberian style of armour. Even within Italy, there's some variation, isn't there, in north and south. Equally, we see Italian armours made for export to Germany, Italian armours made for export to England and France, and so on and so forth. So it's actually way more complex, I think. What do you see as the defining features of Flemish armour in this period? So when we talk about Flemish armour suddenly becoming hugely popular in England, how does it look different to English armour?
Yeah, okay, well, if we're putting ourselves at Bosworth and we're talking about Flemish armor at that moment in England, the first thing is, from a decorative first effect kind of point of view, it has basically no fluting. And that's already a huge contrast to the English armor of this period. In broad strokes, technically, it's generally Italianate. They tend to use asymmetric pauldrons with a bigger, more shield-like pauldron on the left and a lighter, more mobile one on the right. That's pretty typical.
Which is quite a cavalry setup, really, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
So often for poleaxe fighting, we see, even in Italy, you see people switch to smaller symmetrical spolders
Or they just chuck the plates all together and go in the male sleeves.
Yeah, so traditionally, okay, in England we have had large pauldrons, we have had asymmetry, but there was perhaps a slight tendency towards smaller and more mobile shoulder
or just
defences.
pauldrons that are more symmetrical.
Yeah.
If English pauldrons have an asymmetry, it's much less pronounced.
It might be just a small, small shield-shaped
And it
escutula.
might just be a little bit of a cutout in case your lance ends up there, but really we're fighting with that.
But the overall silhouette is quite symmetrical, whereas you look at something like the Avant harness in Glasgow, where it's sort of typical, 14th or 30s, 40s Milanese or Italian harness, incredibly asymmetrical. Every bit of the arm harness almost is, even down to the gauntlets and the counters and the pauldron. It's all very
so
different.
it has a broadly Italianate silhouette, but the Flemish armors tend now to have symmetrical elbows that are usually of the three-piece type: rear brace, coulter, vambrace.
So again, for people who don't necessarily know, so they're not necessarily directly articulated to each other.
No, they're separate pieces that are all are just attached independently.
Sometimes known as floating. And that does arguably give you a bit less protection to solid impacts, but it gives you more mobility. And also, from a modern sort of reenactor or HEMA context, it also gives you a bit more flexibility of size as well. So it's more forgiving. If you get a second-hand armour, it's easier to fit it to you with
That's
a floating.
a hugely important point. We have to think about the long-term, wider practicality of the designs, and the design being as good as it can be for as many people fighting in as many ways as possible.
And even if something's made to fit you, you send off your casts to Milan or Brescia or wherever, and they make some armour for you, and it comes back and it's it's chafing a bit here. It's more likely to be forgiving with these floating arm defences.
So then there are some other little divergences. In the 1480s, the Flemish armourers were some of the first to introduce a solid one-piece breastplate, where you no longer have the lower placard and the upper breastplate strapped down in the center and kind of moving independently to some degree. Now they just say, nope, solid one-piece breastplate is the new way to go. It gives you a purer, cleaner, simpler silhouette, and it's aesthetically pleasing, but they're also able to do that reliably. The skirt, they do concede certain things to Western and possibly English taste. They do sometimes make the skirts a bit longer. They do sometimes still fully enclose the thigh. You do see that on Flemish armor sometimes, but not as really as consistently as on the English armor.
Okay.
There's a number of little details here and there. I've gone into it in exhaustive detail in the book, but that's all what we're trying to evoke with the Richard III armor.
With helmets as well, there's some tendencies with Flemish armour, I think, aren't there, as well? We sort of see strange, I mean, you've dealt with this in your second book, actually, some of these odd, almost early close helmets, I suppose. Yeah, but some of them are a weird hybrid between a sallet and a armet and a close helmet, all sort of mished and mashed together in different ways, aren't they? With unusual solutions for the visor and the neck defense.
And those early close helmets, as I think I showed in my book, are distinctively a Flemish innovation. Now, some people might then look at him and say, okay, Toby, well, why isn't your Richard III wearing a Flemish close helmet, you might ask. Well, this is again where we encounter decisions that have to be made for a number of different reasons. I made the decision to put our Richard III in a sallet for a couple of different reasons. There are good historical reasons, and there are filmmaking reasons.
Yeah.
The filmmaking reasons are that the actor has to deliver lines. We don't have the budget to make a Flemish close helmet, and we don't have the time to make a Flemish close helmet. It's not as much of a priority as getting leg armor that fits, because he's going to have to ride a horse. So if I have the option to borrow a really nice Flemish style sallet of the right period, that's what I'm going to go with.
Yeah.
So there's those reasons. But there's actually another, perhaps more important reason. You know, we now have the remains of Richard III. His skeleton has been studied in, exhaustive detail. And, the wounds that killed him were delivered to the skull without a helmet. He was partially or entirely immobilized. Someone took his helmet off and cut off the back of his skull and stabbed him straight through the skull. And that slicing action especially cannot have occurred with a helmet. So they had to have gotten his helmet off. And then there are these funny scratches on this side of his jaw. And they're just kind of weird. And maybe there could have been a number of things that led to that. But if he was wearing a Flemish close helmet with a plate right here, scratching his jaw, at least while the helmet was on, was not a possibility.
No.
But it is a possibility if someone's got a big dagger and is trying to get it under there while he's struggling around to cut the chin strap.
Yeah.
If you posit that these scratches are evidence that he's wearing a helmet with a chin strap that needs to be cut, that's not a Flemish close helmet either, because those don't have chin straps.
They
just
buckle.
enclose.
Yeah. Okay.
It's the closure and the fit of the neck plates that keeps it on.
Yeah.
So again, chin strap.
Yeah.
We also chose not to put a bever on him. I think Richard III, when he's charging into the battle, he had a bever.
Yeah.
But that's not what was going on in the film.
Yeah.
He's just there, armed on the battlefield, waiting, doing things, and delivering lines. And again, money and time and actor needing to be able to deliver lines, I gave him his nice English style standard.
Also completely historically plausible, because the first thing that comes off when you wear a sallet and a bever is the bever, because it's easy to take off and it's just a nuisance. It's nice to get it out of the way.
And I've documented in my work previously that there's many examples of bevers being jettisoned or just falling off accidentally in the course of battle. And a number of pretty prominent noblemen are known to have been injured or killed as a direct result of losing their bever.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's all. I think it's a tightrope act we're doing here. We're walking this tightrope between maintaining the highest possible standards of authenticity and plausibility as we can, but while working in constraints of budget and time and demands of the production.
So finally, you decided what you wanted the armour to look like, but you had certain constraints of what was available, and you needed to get some of it made. So what happened then?
Well, we just didn't have the time or the budget to make the whole thing from scratch. We had to be very clever about where we spent our budget, where we spent our time, and how we brought it all together. There were some things that just had to be custom made. Royal, surcoats embroidered in gold with the lilies and leopards of England. You can't hire that. We had to make that.
And it's important for it to look right.
We also needed a good arming doublet. You're not going to get a good armor fitting right without a good arming doublet. So the arming doublet and the embroidered surcoat were made by Ninya Mikhaila, famous of the Tudor tailor, and who I've worked with a lot on a lot of different projects. The hosen on his legs were made by Black Swan Designs, Gwen Nowrick in America.
Yeah.
The shoes were made by NP Historical Footwear, who makes arming shoes for me and all my jouster friends. And I made the mail. I knew that, we're not going to have a bever. He's going to get a close-up. Whatever mail he's got at his neck has got to be as good as it can be. So I made that. It's a 6-in-1 weave collar to the pattern of one in the Wallace collection. The 6-in-1 weave we find on a number of English mail collars, as I've documented elsewhere in my book. So I did that, and then we knew we needed to make the leg armor from scratch. Leg armor, the subtle curves of the greaves and the location of the knee. The length of people's legs can vary a lot in different ways. And this is an actor who's going to have to ride a horse and look good on it. The leg armor had to be right. So I knew that a good amount of budget rightly went on the leg armor. Similarly with the arms. We needed good fitting arms that were of the right Flemish style. You can see with the surcoat, the shoulders and the cuirass are covered. But we've got to really pay attention to the exposed elements. And the elbows are one of these Flemish things. We talked about having these, so-called floating elbows. That's a reference I wanted in there to really anchor it stylistically. So the legs, the tassets, and the arms were all made by Fred Ryle in Liverpool. And the lead actor, Harry Lloyd, previously seen on Game of Thrones and lots of other things. He came down and had several fittings with us in Liverpool, stood on Fred's workbench while they sculpted the leg armor onto him. And then the rest of it was completed by hiring pieces. We got some pieces, the helmet and the shoulders and the body armor, and the weapons from Griffin Historical. Mark Griffin. Produces a lot of jousts and different historical events in the UK. And we hired the gauntlets from the Royal Armouries.
Oh, right.
The Royal Armouries hired us quite a few things. We needed armored saddles. We needed more sallets. Most of my jouster friends used clothes helmets and helms, and they didn't have sallets. We needed more sallets. So the Royal Armouries really helped us out a lot.
And they have quite a big stock of, because they do reconstructions and demonstrations. They've got,
So that's kind of how it all came together. And Fred Ryle also made the crown. Crowns are tricky, because they can look very kind of generic and sort of Burger King-ish, And it was my stab at what does a helmet crown, a battle crown actually look like. And I went back to the sources. I looked at a lot of depictions in manuscripts of the period of crowns being worn on helmets, and also just the treatment of the crosses and the lilies. And I wanted it to look like a medieval person's take on the crosses, not generic modern ones, and so that's very much our
There's some examples in the Beauchamp pageant, I think, aren't there, of crowns on helmets? So that's fantastic. And yes, as you said, you made the decision to leave the bever off. But for anyone again who doesn't necessarily know, if you were in a cavalry charge wearing this getup, you would normally have a bever which protects the lower half of your face. You would normally put your visor down. But then in close combat, all bets are off. You might lift the visor up, you might take the bever off.
And again, in the film, nobody says that Richard III is doing anything in particular. He appears as a kind of vision.
Yeah.
Out of someone's imagination, and he talks to the lead character, and he's saying goodbye in all of his finery. We can imagine that he's going off to Bosworth, but it's not said in the film. This just had to be Richard III appearing in his military guise. So, for a lot of reasons that are perfectly legitimate, the bever goes.
Yeah. So, another thing that I was thinking during this, so within the UK, there's an enormous community of people doing Wars of the Roses reenactment. Getting a kit just right takes a long time, but then of course you're doing a number of different battles at different dates. It's problematic because if you're representing a high status individual, you might have owned 3 harnesses in that, between Tewkesbury and Bosworth, you might have 3 or 4 harnesses. Right. But it would be good to see more people within the sort of English Wars of the Roses reenactment sphere looking at Flemish armours, wouldn't it? Because I think they've been neglected. We see some people in sort of Gothic German, which as far as we know there was none of in the Wars of the Roses. We see some people in Italian, which is fine. Some people in English, which is fine, but it would be nice to see more of this sort of Flemish twist, I think, wouldn't it? Because there's some really interesting features on the Flemish armour.
Yeah, but people, at any given moment are working with the sources that they have.
Yeah.
And the third and final part of my English armor project lays all of this out in a way that hasn't been available before.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping to give people who are interested in this kind of thing more sources and more reference material to make these kind of decisions. If they mainly do Towton and that period, this is the way you can think about going. Bosworth, there should be a lot more Italianate, French, and Flemish armor on the field.
And particularly on the Tudor side, there should, of course, be French armour, shouldn't there? Right. Because there was a huge amount of French support. So this kind of Burgundian support on one side and French on the other. I should
say that in my English third part of the English Knight project, I really, I started out, even at that point, with old misconceptions rolling around in my head. And when I set out on this, it was originally a 12-page appendix in my PhD. Yeah. It was just Italian armor. This is all the continental stuff in England is Italian. I know there's no evidence basically at all for German armor in England. It's probably all Italian. Yeah. I did that.
Yeah.
And then even when I'm preparing the final published version of that, I'm still calling things Italian export, Italian export, Italian export. And then I'm looking at certain individual things, like the Beauchamp effigy in Warwick, for example. Yeah. And I'm thinking, that's probably not Italian at all.
Right.
And actually, this isn't Italian. I'll start calling things Italianate because they have a broad Italian
hedge your bets.
But I know for a fact that I don't know it for a fact, but I strongly suspect that I'm actually dealing with a lot of French material here.
Yeah.
French armor made under Italian influence. Italian armorers had very close relations with the French court all the way through the 15th century. There's a lot of French stuff going on. There's Flemish stuff here. So quite late in the process, I was frantically rewriting big parts of my book because I realized it wasn't as accurate as it needed to be.
Yeah.
I think it is now. But that's all you get now. It's done.
So before we wrap up, actually, we should mention the book, and obviously I'll put a link below. So where do we stand at the moment with the book, and what do people need to do?
Okay.
Where can they find it?
After nearly 25 years of work, the Armor of the English Knight project is finished. A lot of your viewers probably already know that book 1 was published in 2015, book 2 was published last year, 2021, and book 3 is now on the runway, on deck for printing. It's not printing yet because this is, again, a kind of unorthodox exercise in guerrilla publishing. The only way I could have total creative control over this production, the only way it could be the way I wanted it to be in every respect, was to circumvent standard, normal publishing practices and not get involved with a big publisher, but do this, with Thomas Del Mar in London. I've been collaborating with for years. We do this. It's a very tight operation. Tom is the publisher, me as the author, designer, printer. That's what you get. But to pare that all down, we really, really depend on pre-orders. Just to fund the basic printing costs, nothing else. Every cent that goes into from pre-orders goes into binding, printing and binding, basically. And that now in 2022 is phenomenally expensive. A lot more expensive even than just last year. So now at the very, very last moment of this project, I've got a challenge here. I don't have enough pre-orders yet. Lots of people have weighed in just in the last couple of weeks, and it's been amazing, but we still need like 50 more. That may not sound like a lot, but for our operation, it's absolutely decisive.
Yeah.
So we got to have those pre-orders before we can print the book. Every pre-order we get makes it come a little bit faster.
So basically, check out the link below and pre-order the book if you can. If you're intending to buy it at some point anyway, then why not just pre-order it now, because it will really help the book happen. So
it's cheaper.
Yeah, and it's cheaper as well.
So you get my eternal gratitude.
And you'll get it quicker as well. So you'll get it quicker and cheaper, so you may as well order it now. So thanks so much, Toby. I will be talking to you also about some other things, but thank you so much for this. And everyone come and visit the exhibition. Obviously visit the Wallace Collection. It's an amazing, unrivaled collection in the centre of London, and free, and it's incredible. So check out the links below. Thanks a lot to Dr. Capwell, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers, folks.
Bye, everybody.